Hello, thank you for coming to this seminar. We have a joint seminar today with Dan and Bethany. I know Bethany from Adelaide. She was the president of ARES there. It was the best committee I have ever volunteered in. It was so practical. We never lost time. Bethany and Dan are very humble. They sent me very short bios, so now I can read them without summarizing them. Bethany Cooper is an Australian Research Council Industry Fellow at the University of South Australia and an adjunct at UWA. Her industry fellowship focuses on the technology choices of water utilities and customer acceptance. Dan Rigby is an economist at the University of Manchester and an adjunct at UWA. Much of his research uses choice experiments to understand choices, preferences, and values. So they're going to speak for 40 minutes, and then Alaya is going to handle the questions. Thank you for that. And I have put some snacks on the table and some drinks. We still have some. When I went last week, I saw some people stealing them, but I didn't. We still have, and I didn't confront them. I told them that's okay, but without smiling.
Thank you very much for the introduction and for the revelation about the snack theft. So it's very nice to be here to present. So Bethany and I are going to present some work which involves an experiment around drinking water preferences. But we thought that we would start off by putting this in a broader context about what are we doing as economists and the ways that we can get data to analyze. So we'll just do some broad stuff, particularly as there's such a big and vibrant PhD community here. We thought that might be a useful context. So we're just going to go have a little bit of context about observing choices and inferring values from those choices, and some of the challenges of stated preference work, primarily around hypothetical bias. And then we'll come on to our sensory taste experiment, and before we wrap it up. Questions? I think best to do sort of clarification questions during the talk. So if there's anything you think I don't understand what that means or that makes no sense, please do say, but then we'll do substantive questions, I would say, at the end. So we, in environmental economics, we're often involved looking at values and trade-offs. And much of economics is involved in trade-offs, but environmental economists have a particularly big challenge because often we're thinking about the trade-offs of interest between humans and non-human systems and beings, etc. So it's complicated. And when we're thinking about humans, the big challenge is we have a whole theory of based around utility. People are maximizing their utility, but we can't observe utility. So that's a big challenge for economics. So what do? Well, we often start from things that we can observe, which are choices, and we try and infer utility and values, etc., from what we observe, that is choices. So if people have some options and they make a choice between them, if they have these two salads which differ in terms of carbon and fat, etc., and one of them, let's say they're both got the same price, but if someone chooses this one, we infer that, well, this one gives them a higher utility than this one because they chose it, if we assume the prices are the same. So where can we observe choices? And there are some broad categories of data where we can observe choices. So we can observe them in real markets with real budget constraints. So in the housing market, we might see houses which have characteristics about the house and the neighborhood it's in, and another house. And if it's got a noisy, smelly factory nearby, we would expect that this house to sell for a lower price than this house, holding everything else equal. Just the presence of that factory next to the house would affect the price, the value that people have for it. So in many respects, this is the gold standard of data because it's not hypothetical, it's real budget constraints, and we can observe lots of transactions in a market. But in many cases, there aren't markets from which we can extract the values that we're interested in, the value of noise or the value of a cleaner, quieter neighborhood, etc. So Lots of us are involved in stated preference experiments where we can design it exactly as we want the choices to be. We can ask about pretty much anything, attributes that aren't legal yet, like food irradiation or something like that, or don't exist yet. And we can design our experiments very, very carefully in how these levels coexist with each other. We can just look at what people choose. And if we have some model of how people are making their decisions, then we can infer the trade-offs and the willingness to pay, the value they associate with lower carbon or lower fat or whatever it might be. So we can design these very flexibly, exactly how we want the scenarios and the options to be with stated preferences. But there are various challenges to this one, but the big one is hypothetical bias, cheap talk, that what people say they would do or how much they would pay is not the real truth, whether because they're strategically behaving or because they just genuinely don't pay enough attention to the price. So that leads us on to, well, what about running consequential experiments with real goods? So this is an example from the American Journal of Ag-Econ looking at sweet potatoes, where one variety has been designed to be biofortified, have added minerals. So you can give people options, you can vary prices, and you can see which ones they would buy. And then you can compare that to what people said they would buy in the different treatment. So this is good stuff. For these consequential experiments, typically it's a fixed good. It's a bundle. It's an orange sweet potato, which is rich in vitamins, etc. You're not mixing these things up like you can with a stated preference experiment. Or maize, Journal of Health Economics, biofortified maize in rural Zambia. Again, the orange maize is rich in vitamins. It's a fixed bundle. You've got three goods that you're running your experiment around. And when we say consequential, what do we mean? We mean that typically we'll be asking people to make repeated choices, just like our standard choice experiment. But at the end, we tell them at the beginning, at the end, we're going to pick one of these choices at random, and we're going to ask you to do what you said you would do. So if you said you would buy that orange maize for however many shillings, you're buying that maize for that many shillings that you said. And that makes hopefully all their choices consequential. We just pick one at random at the end. But these are fixed bundles of goods. Okay, so what you can do is if you have a hypothetical treatment and a consequential treatment, then you can estimate how big the hypothetical bias is, because it's the difference between the two treatments. And then you can test the effectiveness of mechanisms to try and reduce the hypothetical bias. So consequential experiments. But there's a mismatch there between the kind of stated preference experiments we normally do, which are multi-attribute rather than the fixed bundle. And the big challenge there, if you want to do this consequentially, is you've got an experimental design with all these different levels. People pick one to make it consequential. At the end of the experiment, if you draw one of these tasks at random, you've got to be able to give them the salad that they chose. And there are many, many combinations of salad that they could have chosen with all these levels. But it's doable. So this is actually from an experiment that a PhD student I'm working with at Manchester, Jinghan Chen, has done. Got a mate who's a chef in a cafe, reducing the salads corresponding to these levels so you can do the consequential thing afterwards. So that's good, possible. This was another PhD student, Camilla Knudsen, in slums and rural areas in Kenya. Fortified flour. Is it rich in vitamins? Yes or no? Is it sifted? This production thing, and then what the ingredients are. Again, if you want to do this consequentially, you've got to draw one of these things at random and be able to sell them the bag of flour that they chose. That's a challenge. But she did it. She milled her own flour varieties so she could do that afterwards. But it's a challenge to do these things in reality. Another area where real experiments are going to be particularly useful is where we have sensory attributes, smell, taste, visual appearance, particularly smell and taste are hard, or tenderness, for food products. Very hard to convey that by a written level. So these are other water-related experiments which have odor or taste, or odor conveyed by this. It's hard to convey, I think, taste and odor and those sorts of sensory attributes in a sort of standard stated preference scenario. So that leads on to, well, what about trying to use the methods we use for experiments, but with a non-hypothetical, real taste sensory experiment, which leads dramatically to Dr. Bethany.
Thanks very much, Dan, and thanks everyone for the opportunity to speak today. So as Dan said, I'm going to be presenting a study that we did using a sensory choice experiment. So we've been calling it the taste test, and the purpose was to try and understand the drinking water acceptability of the public in South Australia. Oops. So before I go through the experiment, I thought I'd just give a little bit of background about the Australian water context. So Australia's rainfall is highly variable, both over time and geographically. So consequently, it means that there's large parts of Australia that rely heavily on groundwater sources. So you can see in this map that Western Australia, South Australia, and the Northern Territory, you can see that there's large parts in those states in particular that rely on groundwater sources. And the groundwater is highly variable in terms of the water quality. In terms of the potable water supply in Australia, this is mostly managed by water utilities that are owned by state governments. So in Western Australia and South Australia, this has largely resulted in statewide monopolies, and they're responsible for both the metropolitan communities and the regional communities. So you can see from this graph that the water sector collectively in Australia is set to spend large amounts in investing in water infrastructure. And this is due to a number of drivers, so namely the expanding population, also climate change, ageing infrastructure in Australia. So at the moment, around 50% of the water infrastructure is over 50 years in age. But also a significant driver of this need to spend in infrastructure is to meet environmental standards and also water quality standards. So from an economic perspective, we would hope that this investment in infrastructure aligns with customers' expectations and preferences. So in terms of the drinking water in Australia, it's highly variable in terms of the quality of the water, the reliability, and also the aesthetics of the water. So there is a heavy reliance on groundwater, as we saw from the map, particularly in regional and rural communities in Australia. So the intensity of total dissolved solids, which we call TDS, in those groundwater supplies, they have a really big influence on the taste as well as the acceptability of the water. So the water might be safe to drink from these systems, but it's not acceptable by the customers. They're not drinking it because of the aesthetics of the water. So an interesting thing about the Australian Drinking Water Guidelines is that the aesthetic targets, they're not definitive like the health-based targets, so they rely on public expectations. So a level of 600 TDS in the guidelines is regarded as good quality drinking water, but the water utilities are still expected to engage and consult with their customers to see what is acceptable drinking water. And so there are a number of recent studies that have looked at informing upgrades in the water infrastructure in Australia. So they use this 600 TDS threshold to examine willingness to pay by customers for these upgrades in water infrastructure. But to our knowledge, there is very limited or no studies that actually empirically examine whether that 600 TDS threshold is acceptable by customers. So regardless of the expectation in the Australian Drinking Water Guidelines that water utilities need to consult with their customers about the acceptability of drinking water, there's no definitive empirical approach that's being used by the water utilities to do that, to understand, well, what is acceptable from their customers in terms of the drinking water. And so this led us to our key research questions. So we were interested in whether customers, can they actually detect a change in the taste of drinking water? And does this vary across metropolitan and regional water customers? We were also really interested in whether we could empirically identify a threshold for drinking water acceptability and whether that threshold matched the 600 TDS recommendation in the Drinking Water Guidelines. So to answer these, we needed a robust method for systematically testing consumer preferences for drinking water. So initially we set out to use a best-worst scaling approach, but we ended up using a paired comparison approach, which we'll go through in a moment. But in the literature, there was really limited studies that actually used real customers to understand acceptability. And there was limited studies that brought together preferences with thresholds in a non-hypothetical context. Okay, so with the experimental design, initially we put a lot of effort into the pre-testing to set up because it was a real product involving sensory attributes. So we did pre-testing on how many water samples that people could actually handle. So initially when we're thinking best worst, we're thinking could they actually handle 3 or 4 waters and select the best or worst. But it turned out from the pre-testing that that participants could really only handle 2. So we went with using a paired comparison where they only had to then select their most preferred. And then our other challenge was working out, well, how many pairs then can they handle before becoming fatigued? So it was 4 pairs from this pre-testing. And we also trialed doing rinsing in between with a blank water or just a bottled water in between each tasting, which seemed to be effective in the pre-testing. So it was quite challenging with sort of applying a practical experiment. So usually in a hypothetical choice experiment, we could just give people lots of different blocks and versions. But in this case, we were constrained due to practical constraints. So we ended up using the levels TDS. So we had 6 levels and they differed. So the increments were going up by 100 TDS. And interesting, in the literature, it said that consumers can only start to detect the change at 150 TDS change. But in our pre-testing, it seemed that people were picking up at that 100 level. So these were the levels that we went with. All the waters, though, even though the TDS differs, they were the same colour. And they were standardised in terms of the temperature and the chlorine that we used. So we ended up with 24 pairs in the experiment, which we had 6 designs, so 6 versions, and each participant faced 4 pairs. So in terms of the survey administration, we used the survey software program sawtooth, and it was administered in person via tablet. So the tablets were accompanied by the actual real water samples, so people could taste it as they were filling out the survey. And so we administered it to walk-through populations. So these included in offices in metropolitan areas of South Australia, also university campuses, shopping centres. We went to rural field days to get our regional sample. So altogether, our sample was just over 650 participants in metropolitan and rural South Australia. So here's an example of the choice set. So each of the 6 waters, so the 6 levels, they had a unique ID that was hidden from the participants. So we set it up and then took away the template that we used so they couldn't see any IDs on the water samples. And then each sample was just always labelled A or B to avoid anchoring effects. So for example, water A in this choice set could have been water B in the previous choice set. So we can use the paired comparison data from those choice sets to get the ordering of the waters. And so we used a conditional logit, and this is estimated relative to the 700 level. And so the results were intuitive. They were what we hoped they would be. So you can see that the low level of TDS is the most preferred, and then the highest is the least preferred. So we were really happy that the ordering was intuitive and that the participants were discriminating between each of the levels. So they were discriminating at that 100, that change in 100 TDS. So with the paired comparison data, we can get the ordering of the waters. But what we can't get from that data is how that interacts with a threshold. So what's acceptable, what's not. So for example, person A could have the same ordering as person B and person C, but person A might think all the waters are acceptable. Person B might think only half of these are acceptable, and person C might think none of the waters are acceptable. So we needed to interact this with an absolute threshold. So what we did after each of the choice sets, we had 2 follow-up questions. So we asked initially, thinking about the water that you tasted, would you drink the one that you preferred as your usual drinking water? And then it was just a yes, no. And if they said yes, we would then follow up and ask, well, would you drink the less preferred water as your usual drinking water? So with these 2 questions, there are 3 possible response combinations that a participant could have selected. So for example, if a participant selected water 6, in this case, that they preferred water 6, the 3 combinations from the follow-up questions could have been yes, water 6 is acceptable, and then no, water 3 is unacceptable. Or they could say yes, both water 6 and water 3 is acceptable, or no, both water 6 and water 3 is unacceptable. And so in the data, we augment the paired comparison data with these binary water choices against a null option, so the threshold. So we added the threshold data, and again, it's what we hope. The ordering again is still intuitive, but we can now see what's acceptable and what's unacceptable. And so recall that the guideline was recommending a level of 600 TDS as good water quality, and in our study you can see that actually a level of 500, 600 and 700 are unacceptable. So this is the entire sample, and then we looked at a disaggregated sample, so comparing the metropolitan customers with the rural customers. And so again, quite interesting, you can see with the rural customers that a level of 500, 600 and 700 TDS is unacceptable. 300 and 400 kind of borderline, and then it's only really 200 TDS that the rural customers are accepting. In comparison, if we look at the metro customers, 500 and 600 are unacceptable. 500 TDS is borderline, and then we have 200, 300 as well as 400 is acceptable to the metropolitan participants. So I'll hand back to Dan to talk a bit more about the heterogeneity around this. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So we've seen some heterogeneity there in terms of predefined categories. So let's compare the metro versus the rural populations and look at those differences. Typically, one of two ways to go beyond that in terms of heterogeneity would be to estimate latent class models to try and identify segments, latent hidden segments with different preference profiles and see who's in each of those groups. And then the other way to go would be a mixed logit model. Assume there's a distribution of preferences for drinking water quality and try and estimate the mean and the standard deviation of that distribution. And I think I'm just going to give my soapbox view on these models. So because people often have a challenge. Well, I've got some choice data. I don't know which of these sorts of models to go for. They're both respected, sort of empirically sound models. I think it depends what you want to do. And the thing that bugs me about mixed logit studies, which I've bored Michael with endlessly, is that you have to see mixed logits report, and they report the mean, and they say the mean estimate is over here, and there is significant variation around the mean, which you think, well, you're not. The second point is like it would be interesting if there was no variation around the mean. You found something from which there is no heterogeneity around. That would be a real interesting result. But generally, there's always nearly always variation around the mean. And if you're just reporting the mean estimate, that's pretty much going to be what you get from a simple conditional logit model. So it kind of seems like not much point unless you're going to do. And so what I think we miss out on in economics often is the fact that you get estimates of each individual participant's marginal utilities, their preferences, conditional on this distribution that you've estimated. And in the market research world, where these choice experiments, conjoint as it's called in that world, where economics kind of borrowed these methods from, those individual estimates is really what they're interested in, because once you've got those, you can simulate policies or products or park configurations or whatever, and simulate which one people prefer. And then you can think about, well, referendums and votes on which one they like best. So we're going to look at the individual level estimates. So these are the individual level estimates for water one, the best one, 200 TDS. They're slightly tidied up into bins, but this is, these individual level estimates I think are really interesting. What does that reveal? So for the best quality water, this is for the whole sample, 78% of them have got a positive marginal utility. They think it's acceptable. Well, that's our 78% up here who think that 200 is acceptable. We can do the same thing for water, 300 TDS, 400 TDS, and we can get how many of them have got a positive marginal utility for. And unsurprisingly, we get 200, 300, and 400 are all above 50%. So if there was a vote, you would pass the referendum that is acceptable drinking water quality. These levels of TDS 5, 6, and 700 are all below 50%. They would fail the referendum test. And only 37% are indicating that they think that the 600 TDS level, the standard for good quality drinking water, is actually water that they regard as acceptable. So yes, I think using these individual level estimates is a useful thing to do. Here we've only got one attribute, so we can't really get into market simulations of alternative 1 versus alternative B, but we get an idea about the proportions of the population who think something's acceptable. And on that dramatic plot, over to Bethany to finish off.
Thank you. What did you?
There we go.
So just to, I guess, summarize our key findings or take-home messages from this study. So from our study, we can see that the public, they can actually detect a change in the taste of drinking water, and at that 100 level of TDS, they're being discerning. And we saw from the graphs that there is actually a difference in the acceptability of TDS between regional customers and metropolitan customers. So our study showed that it is possible to empirically identify a threshold of acceptability for different customers, and it's showing that that level 600 TDS level is not acceptable for the majority of the sample. And so this study has important implications in terms of informing investment in infrastructure going forward. It's raising a number of questions. For example, is it worth investing to deliver that 600 TDS level if the public aren't actually valuing that improvement, if they're not accepting it? Also, in terms of future research, we would like to bring in willingness to pay to this on top of that acceptability. So incorporating information about, well, what would participants actually be willing to pay for this improvement in their tap water in tandem with the taste experiment. So thanks very much, everyone, for your time, and we're happy to take questions.
That proves that people are pinched on time and we don't ask them many questions. I will handle the questions until you go. Okay?
One thing with water is, I describe perfect water a bit better. You sort of get used to it.
Oh, no.
So does it matter what sort of quality of water your respondents had? And the other thing is there any important correlation that you have an absolute shocker of the glass of water into the same TDS? Did that suddenly mean that you looks favourable on a 400?
You can talk about it later in class.
So, yeah, I do think. Well, okay. Well, we do find an effect on what people have got, what they're currently drinking. So we identified what they were currently, where their current drinking water comes. Do they drink tap? And if they're in rural areas, does the tap come from rainfall collection or groundwater, whatever? So, okay. So we estimated the latent class model and included in those. Let's just show what we got. So, yeah, this is with 3 classes. So these people think all the waters are acceptable. Goldilocks. These people think none of the waters are acceptable, and these people have got, they think some are and some aren't. Okay. Now, the people who are more likely to be in this group are people who are the significant effects. If their current water is, they drink bottled water, they drink filtered tap water, or they drink rainwater. So those people, so I think there is an effect on what people are currently drinking that corresponds into what they view. Older people are more likely to be in the it's all fine, and women are more likely to be in the no, it's fine. But yeah, we do. So I think there is, plausibly and empirically an effect on what you currently see question about whether there's an anchoring effect on whether if you got a shocker in your first pair of waters. Do you have a
No, I think we just tried.
the song?
I think we just tried to account for that in the pre-testing, and that's when we brought in like that with the rinsing in between tasting each of the samples, which seemed to then, it seemed that then people started to be able to discern between the different levels.
I think we should test for that. And in a normal choice experiment, you'd have loads of different versions, so you'd sort of think that would all being sort of come out in the wash, so there wouldn't be that many people getting the 7 bad water up front, but we were limited in the number of blocks just because it's practically you can't implement 300 different designs on the water tablets. So, but I think we'll have to look at that.
Yeah.
Are there any questions from the PhD students? Ella, Manuel, okay, Emma.
In Perth, as I understand it, a lot of the water supply comes from retail. Yeah. How is that taken into account in your experiment, or is it not at all?
In terms of the desal taste.
Desal and TDS have any correlation, or is it a whole other thing? Because sometimes I think that our water supply smells a bit like the ocean and not in a good way. So
yeah, so this particular experiment was just focused on TDS levels, which is for groundwater systems, because in South Australia, that's what the interest was from the utility around where they have to make decisions around upgrading their infrastructure is for the ones that rely on groundwater systems, and that often involves building desal plants to mix with the groundwater. So there's questions around, well, to what extent do we need the desal to then mix with the groundwater so that it is acceptable? So for this study, we just were focusing on TDS, but you could, I guess, do it with different, other variations around desal, different levels of chlorine. But in this case, we were just focusing on TDS because that's the question at the moment that the utilities are looking at to inform their investment in infrastructure. Yeah.
And TDS seems to be used internationally as the
yeah, and that's right. Yeah.
Just one quick question. It's a bit unrelated, but going from 600 to 400, maybe is that feasible, or the marginal cost?
Yeah, so that's something that we're in the process of looking at as well. Now that we have this data, what we'll do now is look at, well, what's the marginal cost for each of those, levels to actually bring it down, and then, then it can inform the decision. What's the marginal cost to achieve lower levels? Yeah.
400 seems quite
acceptable. Yes.
Yeah, any other questions from the PhD students? No, okay, my name's first for them.
Okay, I just 2 questions. First of all, I'm interested in knowing why you are advertising that you expect any difference between the people and the metropolitan. Why not any other category, maybe based on the age of people? Why rural and metropolitan? And then the other question goes to Dan. I think what you're saying was very interesting when you're trying to measure what is the bias. So based on your repeating preference and your consequential natural experiment. But my question is that, okay, what you're trying to describe is that after they have finished doing the experiment, then randomly you choose and you'll expect it to buy one of the choices that they made. But then it's just a one-time thing that they are doing. It's not repeated. So there will still be bias in that, because all what you're observing is just a one-time, and that may be influenced by that time when they are just playing the game. But or they're doing the experiment, but randomly if you choose them when they are not doing doing the experiment, will they be making that choice? Yeah, I'll be on to you.
Okay, so So the literature talks about how, and what Ben raised, that the current sort of people's histories of what they're used to drinking will impact their preferences. And so it's very, in South Australia, the water supplies are very different in metropolitan versus rural communities. From the water utilities point of view, it was probably the most relevant question to look at, because they're looking at the upgrades in the region. So we wanted to, for them, that was the interesting variable. But we did, as Dan mentioned, we did collect variables around age, gender, and that is actually showing to be significant as well. But from the utilities perspective, that regional versus metro is the most useful, rather than the age and gender. Yeah.
Thanks. I mean, and on the question about in the how consequential is consequential, really? You've got people in to do an experiment or whatever, and you said we're going to pick one at random. So, how realistic is that? Well, it's not as realistic as good quality market data, but we don't often have the option of seeing these products in the market. I suppose one, so I agree that it would be a big claim just to say, well, I now believe that if they said they would buy the sweet potato at that price, they will from now on do it. I suppose one indication that it's having an effect. So if we go back to, if we go on to Camilla's experiment with the sort of fortified, vitamin fortified flour. So she had the consequential treatment where they have to do what they said in one of the tasks. What people said they would do in the task, their willingness to pay was about, I think, about 20% higher than in the purely hypothetical, which tells you that there's an effect. That you saying we're going to ask you to buy something if you said you would buy it in one of these tasks at random, can't say that it's brought them to market truth, but it's definitely moving them away from what they would say hypothetically. So it's along the way. How far along the way it is to real market behavior, I don't know. It's an entirely fair point.
There was next on that mine. So on my next bit, I think I remember hearing that when they make desal water, if they just give that to people to drink, they don't like that either. Like with the 0 TDS, and they actually have to add some salts in, which is sort of intriguing because your graph there's no turning over. It looks like it's heading up as you go further and further to the left. It's my memory right. Do those do that?
I mean, it is. I mean, Melbourne's talks about how they had customer complaints before they turned on the desal, just when they built it, of people saying they don't like it. So you sort of wonder how much that's influencing. But I think we could, depending on the state and context, we could vary the levels to pick up, if that's something in Perth. So we could use different levels. So in this case, in South Australia, working with SA Water, these were the sort of the feasible levels that they would be able to look at bringing it down to, was 200 TDS at the lowest. So I guess in other states it might be quite different, and particularly capital cities. So we could change the levels to suit, I guess, the question that the utility's looking at. So it's relevant to their water supply.
Slightly different topic. So the term acceptability is quite open.
Yeah.
You've got a way to define it. Would you drink it?
Yeah.
But there's no price against that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I also wonder whether there's like a psychological factor going on there.
Yeah.
The people that have decided to tap water is crap and they're always going to drink bottled water.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, are they just almost by, bottled water is not low in TDS either.
No.
Some of it's over 700.
Yeah. That's right.
So I reckon, you know, they're probably distorting themselves half the time when they say this is acceptable. My water's much better, but probably not even as good.
Yeah, I guess so we didn't tell them whether it was bottled. Yeah, so they didn't know sort of the blind taste test. So some were asking, you know, is this recycled water? Like and so we didn't tell them what it was. So it could have all been bottled water, it could have been desal. So at the end, if people were really interested, we talked about, well, it's actually TDS, which is coming out of your tap. So yeah, hopefully sort of overcome some of those pre-existing biases. Yeah.
I'm talking about triangulating your acceptance. Do you have data on complaints by people to their local water board, see if that matches onto the local TDS that's happening, or on the purchase of bottled water, as to whether that actually is also matching on?
Yeah.
Are people actually revealing it by switching out of their tap water into other water? You trying to get some
Use that data, so that's a good suggestion. Yeah, to do that. So to triangulate with the complaints data. Yeah, that's a good suggestion.
And I was quite surprised at the proportion of people who just don't drink their tap water in this sample. It was, I don't know, it was around.
Yeah, in the region,
50%.
yeah, overall it was around 50% just don't drink their tap water.
So they've already decided it's not acceptable. So
yeah, and that's like Dave's point.
I reckon it's by fashion.
Yeah.
Actual taste.
no, these are entirely rational.
Are there any other questions from PhD candidates or from Alex? No? Okay, let's go to Curtis then.
Just a comment, but just the thought I had, building on what Ben is talking about with anchoring effects, or I guess my first thought is I feel like it's going to be more relevant for the anchoring question than the comparison and the order effect of what they saw probably. So if I've seen 700 first, I might think it's acceptable, but if you give me 200, I might change. But then I was also thinking, presumably everyone's seen the same water multiple times. It might be interesting to look at when people are inconsistent in their anchoring question across reps. This couple of thoughts I was having that I wanted to say before I forgot them. Might be interesting to see, yes, I saw 500 and said it's unacceptable, and it's not again, I thought it was good another time to explain why that might be happening.
Yes, we could dig into that definitely in terms of those inconsistencies and whether there's any preference reversals. Like that, I mean, there's a 6 waters and 4 pairs, so there's not that much reversal opportunity, but there is about. I just thought it was acceptable, and now I'm telling you it's not acceptable.
Okay.
Could you ask people if they actually ever drink water? I don't actually drink water.
We did have that question. Yeah, we did.
We filtered those people out. If they didn't drink water.
Yeah, don't drink this.
Pure,
this isn't for you.
Yeah, I think that those are the only people that we filtered out.
Anyone? Okay, I have a question meanwhile now. What's so can you talk a little bit more about how the consumer perception of water with a certain amount of TDS might vary according to what those TDS are and the composition of the substances that are dissolved in the water?
About what it is that's dissolved.
Yeah, so I would have guessed that it's not just the number of TDS, but also what those TDS are.
Yeah, so we do have all that information because one of our collaborators is a scientist, and so we have all that information, and so they, to the best they could, technically standardized all the samples so that there wasn't, and removed the salts that would actually have overpowering, and tried to standardize that. So we do have that information around the composition of it. But for the experiment, we held all that constant. Yeah, and it's from the same source.
Are you suggesting that if we had other waters with different stuff dissolved in them, a 600 of one thing would be very different from a 600 of another thing that's dissolved? Or,
Yeah, but they did, yeah, that's what they did, yeah. Our expertise, but yeah, we did have worked with the scientists around that, yeah.
We have a question from Faye online. Did you look at other socio-demographic factors that could have affected their preferences?
So what was it? Age, gender?
Age and gender and their current water
Yeah.
source and whether they were in metro and
Or
rural.
rural.
Those are the things that were all in the latent class model.
Yeah.
We know
That
roughly
was-
where they live, but
yeah.
we don't have a massive amount of, because it's kind of done in supermarkets and, you know, a walk-up thing.
Yeah, we tried to limit all
Yeah.
extra questions, so they were the sort of key ones we used, and we sort of really wanted to pick up on postcode and what their current water source was. Yeah.
I guess we could, from their postcode, pull in other broad demographic stuff that is
Yeah.
recorded at postcode
Yeah,
level.
actually
and
that
bring that in.
Yeah, around income.
When you say consequential reveal preference, is that you keep the money just to put that in products that happen?
So this one isn't really, I wouldn't say this.
No, this one, the one with the sweet potato.
Okay.
Yeah.
So they get some money to participate in the experiment.
Yeah.
And then, so again, that's another thing, going back to our main point about how realistic it is. You, particularly like doing that stuff that Camilla was doing with the, like in slums of Nairobi and, you know, saying you've got to buy this flour now is challenging ethically and otherwise. So participants normally get some participation fee, but then they then have to, you'd say to them, come along tomorrow, or you know, or on these dates, you'll be able to pick up your fee, the product you bought, and that will, the price you said you would pay for that product will be deducted from your fee. Now, they don't need to turn up if they honestly think, what have I done? We've all done it. What have I bought? That's a big mistake. Ultimately, they don't have to turn up, but that would mean they would lose their participation fee, etc. We had in Camilla's experiment with the flour in Kenya, had very little no-shows. So people generally turned up and got their fee, made their purchase.
Okay, we're going to Dave and now Alain as the manager.
It's serious.
So just thinking back on the hypothetical bias thing, and you know, we used some real experiments to as a way of trying to reduce hypothetical bias. But it strikes me that if you go to the next stage of trying to get willingness to pay for different qualities, that will still be hypothetical. You're getting real preferences before you get to prices, but the prices still lead to hypothetical willingness to pay. I think. Do you agree?
Yeah, because they wouldn't actually be
You
getting the supply.
No.
Yeah, so I guess it's sort of a step. Yeah.
So I suppose there's a number of different reasons why you would want to do experiments with real goods. You've got the hypothetical bias thing, so the consequential, pick one at random afterwards. You've got the challenges of doing that with multi-attribute goods. In this scenario, it was really started from a straight, can people tell the difference? How can we design an experiment to see if they can tell the difference? We sort of went down this road. Let's do a best worst thing. 3 or 4 options is too much. We ended up going back to the origin of the best worst, which is just paired comparisons. We then looked in the literature at what other people have done, and it was quite interesting. So it's a whole different discipline world of doing taste tests. They tend to do, well, the examples we looked at seem to do, they would do ramp up the water qualities to find your acceptability. So that's not randomizing the order, etc.
They would get heaps.
Yeah, and they'd often use trained testers, etc. So I suppose that naive thing of coming to something where there's an established literature, but we come from a different disciplinary. So we've done something a bit different from what other people have done, and it's seems to work out okay. But yes, if we ask them afterwards, they say it's acceptable, would you pay so many dollars a month or whatever, we are back into hypothetical.